Part 1. Into the Forest, Chapter 2. The Rose Calls. Only my love for my sister could have forced me into the clearing, where I was an open target for any of the monsters in the forest. Only the thought of saving Catri's life could have given me the courage to reach past the sparks and sparkles surrounding the enchanted rose, kneel in the damp dirt, and grab its stem at the base. Only for my sister would I have risked it all. I grabbed the stem of the rose with my left hand, careful to avoid thorns, and wielded my dagger in my right. The moment I touched the rose, 1,000 images of beauty coursed through me, filling me with a wonderful awe. Things I had never seen. Things I could never have imagined. Fields of gold and jewels. Waterfalls lit in pinks and purples. Sunsets lit like rainbows. Flowers, beautiful enough to take my breath away. Faces of beautiful people so perfect that they couldn't have been from this world. A sense of perfect love that made me want to cry with joy. There was power here. Immense power. I never wanted to let go. But even though my senses were overwhelmed with beauty in all of its forms, I still had enough common sense to realize that a prize this valuable and powerful could be dangerous in anyone's hands, but especially in those of a witch. At the same time, my doubts that this rose could make Catri young again and beautiful too vanished. If only I knew how to use it. Yet, how could I cut it? Darkness and fog were fast closing in around me. With tears streaming down my face, I pictured Catri's face and slid my dagger into the flesh of the rose cane near the ground to make sure I got the most stem. From Morel's warning, I expected to have to work harder to cut through the cane of the bush. But I was strong and used to hard work, and my dagger was sharp. It cut through the cane in a single vicious slice. The moment the rose came free in my hand, the beautiful images vanished. The overwhelming, joyful feeling of love evaporated. The connection was broken. I was left with only my mortal human love for my sister. But the rose still sparkled. It still had power. I bowed my head, apologizing silently to the rose for taking it. Your life and magic aren't for me. I'm not that selfish. I have no need of them. You give your essence for my sister. She's worth everything. Your sacrifice isn't in vain. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, hoping the scent would bring the connection to beauty back. Its fragrance was like nothing I'd ever breathed before. Heavenly perfume, rose perfection, untainted with any hint of mildew or decay. Nothing that interfered with its essence and bouquet. Old ladies give the scent of rose a bad reputation as belonging to the ancient, but this scent was so youthful it was almost eternal. I smiled to myself, happy for the first time in ages. Amazed that I could feel joyful in this frightening deep darkness. Out of nowhere, without making a sound to announce itself, something slammed into my left hand with brutal, wicked force. The impact knocked my arm outward away from my body. My hand reflexively uncurled, losing its grip on the rose. I screamed. My eyes flew open in time to see the rose flying in an arc away from me. I watched its trajectory into the heart of the foggy glen in horror. It landed too far away for me to reach, still glowing, lighting the fog even more brilliant blue. The fog seemed to have a life of its own. It closed in on the rose, trying to snuff out the light. I doubled over, cradling my hand in my lap helplessly. It was useless. I couldn't move my fingers. I couldn't move, period. The pain and the shock were so excruciating that they took my breath away. The darkness seemed to close in and dance around me. A shadow here on one side of me, then on the other, as if studying me from all angles. This darkness was alive, and it was toying with me, trying to terrify me. I didn't want to tell it, but it needn't have tried so hard. I was already petrified. If I were going to survive, I had to get the rose back while it still glowed, and get out of the clearing. I fought nausea. Cold sweat broke out on my brow. My stomach heaved. I swallowed hard against it, trying not to show just how terrified and helpless I was. I silently prayed for something, anything to save me. Where were those infamous marauding Duve bears when I needed them? Something landed with a bush-shaking thud to my right, just in front of me in the clearing. I jumped, startled and winced with pain, but I dared not look. However, the dark, heatless presence that stood over me seemed amused. I had been avoiding the darkness's gaze, but if I were going to fight, I needed to size up my opponent. I swallowed hard and looked up into the face of the most dangerously gorgeous man I had ever seen. It was a dark and vicious beauty, cold to its core but nonetheless stunning. He was tall and perfectly proportioned, with broad shoulders that spoke of great strength. It was hard to explain how I could see him in the darkness, but the fact that he almost absorbed light seemed to make it possible. He was clad immaculately in expensive black leather, and decorated with black jewels, diamonds and onyx, that seemed not to reflect the light, but rather trap it. His clothing befit high-ranking nobility. He was dressed for battle. His eyes were equally dark and soulless, but magnetic at the same time. To my horror, I felt them sucking at the last of my warmth. Somehow, I managed to hang on to the dagger in my right hand.
Thief.
His voice was deep and seductive, mesmerizing even as it accused me. It was almost as if he were issuing me a compliment. It wasn't until he spoke that I realized he was winged. He walked around me, spreading his large black sparkling wings as if to further intimidate me. As if he were playing with a mouse. He needn't have bothered. I was already immobilized with fear. He moved like smoke and shadow, which explained how he'd sneaked up on me without making a sound in the first place. He clearly wasn't human. I might have been happy for that, given other circumstances. On the bright side, at least one of the very human villagers hadn't just outplayed me for the rose. The bushes nearby rattled again. Without thinking, I turned toward them. The source of the thud became obvious. A breathtaking young man lay on the ground. He had pushed up into an awkward sitting position. He was also exceptionally well built, and dressed richly in gear appropriate for a high-ranking official or soldier. But there was much more than dark and smoke to him. He was alive with warmth and heat and substance. The rose's glow lit him in a flattering golden light, doing its best to hide the bruising and swelling from a vicious beating that had apparently been interrupted when he thudded into my glen. His left eye was swelling shut. His lip was fat and blood ran from his nose. He wiped the blood with his sleeve and rose to a stand. "He's beautiful." Maybe that was the rose talking. Or maybe it was me talking to myself. But somehow, I knew it to be true. I'd never seen such a perfectly formed man before. Which, yes, I lived in the land of misfits, but even still. Our eyes met. The heat of his gaze spread over me, reaching to my most intimate areas. An emotional jolt and connection, so shocking and strong it felt almost physical, rocked me back. It must have been the shock I was in, but it was almost as if I could read his mind.
Run.
He lunged for the dark man. This was my chance to escape, and I was grateful for it. But I couldn't leave without that rose. Without it, I was doomed to die in the forest. Maybe I was doomed anyway. The winged darkling focused on the handsome injured man. While the darkling's attention was diverted, I pushed to a stand and made a dash for the rose. But the darkling wasn't intimidated by either of us. He calmly knocked back my would-be rescuer with a flick of his wrist, sending him sprawling without touching him. The darkling moved like the fog itself to the rose and ground it into the ground with his heel. He may have moved like mist, but he definitely had power and might and material form. The rose lay bruised beneath his feet. No. I lunged for him. The young man scrambled to his feet. With one hand, the dark fae held him back, squeezing his throat with an invisible grip. With the other, he swatted me away as if I were as inconsequential as gossamer. The light of the rose had dimmed, but it still flickered. I hadn't come this far to be defeated. I sprawled on the ground, dazed, pretending to have fainted, hoping the winged creature would lose interest in me while he toyed with the other man, and I thought up a plan. The injured man was gasping. My eyes were closed, but I was tortured by the terrible rattling as he struggled to breathe. The darkling must have tightened his grip. The gasping grew more desperate.
Give it up. The Queen wants you alive, more's the pity. For you. As long as I deliver you still breathing, I can torture you all I like. She didn't specify how intact you have to be when I deliver you. Or how pretty.
His laugh was low and seductive despite the wickedness he was inflicting. He seemed genuinely amused. However, he was the only one among us who found the situation funny.
A quick death would be easier and more merciful. Believe me.
Something in me snapped. I weighed the odds and realized that either way fate favored me dying. Either at the hands of this dark fae or lost wandering in the woods. Maybe the darkling was right. Better a quick death at his hand. He hadn't promised me I'd live than a slow death in the forest. Another violent gasp wrenched my heart. I couldn't shake our connection. I couldn't push his bruised face out of my mind. I couldn't make myself so selfish that I would let him suffer without trying to help him. I lost my temper and with it my sense of fear. Mother had taught me it was better to go down fighting than willingly accept death at another's hand. At best, I hoped to free the other man. He at least had a chance at life. Talk all you like, darkling. Keep making your little speech. I clenched the dagger so tightly my fingers ached in the cold. I'd only have one chance. I opened my eyes just a crack, mentally measured the distance, weighed the long odds, pushed myself up with my elbow and sprung to my feet. Never underestimate the element of surprise. I caught the darkling off guard. Unfortunately, not off guard enough. Just as my dagger met the soft flesh of his bare neck, he caught my hand. Our eyes met. His flamed with fury. I was sure I was dead. I'd barely nicked him. A small trickle of dark, nearly black blood ran down his neck. His eyes went wide. He dropped my hand and slapped his hand over the small cut on his neck.
Which?
A flap of his wings, and he disappeared like a shadow. Shaking and stunned, I fell to the ground, protecting my injured hand in my lap and breathing hard. I wasn't sure what had just happened. I turned to my companion. "Are you all right?" He rubbed his throat. "I'll survive. Thanks to you." His voice was scratchy. "What about you?" "I'm alive." He nodded grimly. He handed me the rose. "I believe this belongs to you." For some reason, I reached for it with my left hand. Maybe because my right was still clutching the dagger, and I couldn't make myself loosen my grip. It took all my resolve to move two of my fingers enough through the pain to grasp the rose. As I turned to thank him, he cocked his head, listening to something I couldn't hear. "You have to get out of the forest." He shoved me down and pushed me into the bushes. "Hide." Before I could respond, a pair of fae appeared on either side of him. I hunkered down in my hiding spot, hiding the rose beneath my cloak. The pair grabbed him beneath his arms and pulled him roughly to his feet while he struggled against them. With a rustle of wings, they disappeared with him, leaving a trail of sparkles in their wake. I stared open-mouthed at the space where he had been just moments before. I was devastated and heartbroken. How often did one encounter such beauty anywhere, but especially in this remote part of the world? Or such self-sacrifice? I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. I'd cowered, just left him to his fate. Even though any attempt on my part would have most likely been futile, and I had Katri to think about, shame wouldn't leave me alone. He wanted to save me, wanted me to hide and stay hidden. Mother had taught me to accept gifts with good grace. He'd known they were coming for him and sought to spare me, that much was clear. But my actions still didn't sit right with my conscience. Coward. It did no good to dwell on it now. This was no place to linger. I pulled the rose out from beneath my cloak. It was crushed and wilting fast. missing many of its petals. Morel had said it would lead me out of the forest. When I'd asked how, she'd simply reiterated that it would. Looking at it now, I wondered how, and whether it had enough strength left to do the job. It was freezing in the woods. Even the fingers on my good hand were growing stiff. I pulled my gloves from my cloak pocket, and wincing managed to gingerly pull them on over my battered fingers, hoping the gloves would protect the rose and preserve its remaining magic as well as keep me warm. How do you talk to a rose? I decided to try the light-hearted approach. I looked it directly in its remaining petals. Its poor bud head drooped terribly. Well, are you going to sit there wilting? Or are you going to get us out of here before the next set of evil fae arrive? I caught one of its petals as it fell and fluttered toward the ground. I put it gently in my pocket. I'll just keep this safe for you. In all seriousness, dear Rose, I'd appreciate your help. Point the way, and I'll carry you out of here. I'll take good care of you, I promise. One side of the rose sparkled and shot out a beam of light in one direction as if pointing the way. Since being hit by the darkling, I was totally disoriented. I had no idea which direction I'd come from, or where the village lay. I was at the rose's mercy. I hoped it had a better sense of direction than I did. I guess I'll have to trust you,